1763. The British Empire is victorious. The largest war the world had ever seen had just been fought, and as a result, the British have finally, for the most part, kicked out their colonial rivals, the French, out of North America. Huge, vast lands of North America have now fallen into British hands. But those lands are not empty, as various tribes of American Indians have been living in the wilderness, generally keeping their distance from the primarily settled British colonies in America. Over the years, the Indians have been pushed back over and over again by the British and French, though both sides tried to gain their own Indian allies. The World War that was just fought would be known as the 7 Years' War, but for those who served the British in the American theater of the war, it was called the French and Indian War due to the complex system of alliances between the European powers and the Indians. For example, the Iroquois Confederacy had allied itself with Great Britain, while the Ottawa tribe under one Chief Pontiac had allied itself with France. Because each side was trying to win over the favor of the Indians for the upper hand in the wars, the relationship between the Indians and the Europeans at this time wasn't necessarily one of genocide. But things changed with the end of the war. The French were gone, and the French tended to focus on trading with the Indians rather than conquering them, causing the French to see the Indians as a civilized people to some extent. But the British were much more focused on a proper land empire and conquering, or dislocating the Indian tribes. Compared to the French, many British saw the Indians as uncivilized savages and treated them as such. And now, besides the Spanish Empire that was largely empty in this part of North America, the British, fresh off their greatest victory, were the only Europeans the Indians had to deal with. Everyone knew this wasn't a good situation for the Indians. Pontiac was a tall, powerful warrior chief, and was known for his charisma and diplomatic skill. He recognized the threat posed by his enemy Britain, and it didn't take long for him to form a large coalition of other American Indian tribes in his corner of North America. Many of the newly acquired territories had not been consolidated by Britain, especially since many British settlers in America hadn't had the chance to pick up and move to what used to be French territory. If the Indians were going to protect the interior of the continent from the British, the time to strike was now, immediately after the end of the 7 Years' War, before Britain could mount a defense. It needed to be a swift seizure of the lands, a blitzkrieg, with enough force to put fear into the hearts and minds of the British so that they would never return to that land again. After all, when your enemy has all the advantages over you, the psychological element was the most important one. If the British feared and treated the Indians as savages, then it was savagery they were going to get. It starts in the spring of 1763. Pontiac's American Indian alliance surrounds and besieges Fort Detroit. Fort Detroit was once an outpost of the French colonial empire that had been ceded to the British Empire following the end of the war. The garrison was a British military force, while the colonists within the fort were largely French. In Pontiac's attack on Fort Detroit, many British soldiers were killed, with one even cannibalized by the Indians, as it was a ritual in the Great Lakes Indian culture. While blood was spilled at Fort Detroit, the Indians left the French alone. Their war was with the British, not the French. As the siege continued at Fort Detroit, one British garrison after another was surrounded and destroyed. As part of the psychological warfare campaign, British soldiers, traders, and their families all suffered gruesome fates, from being killed or tortured, mutilated, or even eaten. The terror is not only gruesome, but fast, and often spreads faster than the news about the war. Often, the British don't know to be ready for trouble until Indian war bands come knocking at their door. One event that illustrates how unprepared and uninformed the British were is the story of Mackinac, a British fort in the region. A large group of Ojibwa Indians, part of Pontiac's Ottawa alliance, approached the fort. They began a game of lacrosse outside the walls, and the British came out to watch and cheer, laughing and enjoying the amicable atmosphere. The lacrosse game gradually became more and more intense before one of the players threw the ball close to the gate to the fort. The Indian teams both bolted after the ball, but suddenly snatched war axes from underneath the robes of their women and rushed through the unguarded gate, catching the British completely by surprise. What followed was a massacre. This is a quote from one British trader at the fort who hid in a storage closet during the incident. Through an aperture which afforded me a view of the area of the fort, I beheld, in shapes the foulest and most terrible, the ferocious triumphs of barbarian conquerors. The dead were scalped and mangled, the dying were writhing and shrieking under the unsatiated knife and tomahawk, and, from the bodies of some, ripped open, their butchers were drinking their blood, scooped up in the hollow of joined hands, and quaffed amid shouts of rage and victory. Events like this were common throughout the new provinces of the British Empire. Garrisons continued to fall until the entire region west of Fort Pitt, namely the Ohio and Illinois areas, were overrun by Pontiac's alliance. The new territories Britain had just won were under the threat of being lost. 2,000 settlers were killed in the genocide, along with 400 soldiers and many, many more taken prisoner. Only few survived who managed to make it back to the 13 colonies, giving their tales of horror. Indeed, it appeared as if the Indian strategy of instilling fear worked wonders. But a psychological terror campaign is a double-sided sword. Sure, you can make your enemies flee in terror, but if they decide to stay and fight, that enemy will fight with every ounce of their being, with restraints like ethics cast aside. When fighting a war of fear, you need to beware what your enemy becomes when he is scared. General Geoffrey Amherst was the British leader of British America, though he wasn't necessarily happy with the position. To the homeland British, the Americas were a backwater populated by inferior, under-civilized, and under-educated people. Amherst, a large man with a big nose and just as big of an ego, believed that deploying him to America was a waste of his talents, especially with the 7 Years' War over. However, while residing at the British headquarters in New York, he received reports of Pontiac's war out west. While he is shocked by the savagery, he isn't necessarily surprised. To Amherst, if there was anything worse than an American settler, it was an American Indian, who he, like many other British officers throughout history, deemed to be uncivilized savages. It was one thing when the British were using them against the French, but the French were now gone, and now it was time to remind the Indians who the true power on the continent was. First, he ceased sending gifts, guns, and ammunition to all Indian tribes as a whole, while he followed reports of the war, alerting forts and preparing troops. As time went on, however, Amherst shifted his outrage at the Indians towards his own officers. At Presque Isle, the commanding officer surrendered the fort to the Indians. Following the surrender, the Indians massacred the garrison. Upon Amherst hearing this, he was both outraged and confused by the actions of his own men.
It's amazing that the officer could put so much faith in the promises of the Indians as to capitulate with them. There are so many instances of them never failing to massacre the people whom they persuade to put themselves in their power. The officer and garrison would have much better chance for their lives if they had defended themselves to the last. And if not relieved, they had confided to retreat through the woods or got off on a boat in the night. These people undoubtedly murdered, unless the Indians may have feared to do it lest we may retaliate. There is absolutely nothing but fear of us that can hinder them from committing all the cruelties of them in their power.
With his back to the wall, Amherst decided to resort to something that was frowned upon even at the time: biological warfare. After all, it seemed the Indians only feared one thing from the Europeans, and that was their diseases. Indeed, throughout history, diseases carried unintentionally from Europe and had a nearly apocalyptic effect on the American Indian population. In this time of need, Amherst determined that it was an advantage he needed to press. Amherst ordered Henry Bouquet, a Swiss mercenary and the commander of British and American forces in the West, to launch his campaigns, as he wrote,
"Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disinfected tribes of the Indians? We must on this occasion use every stigmatum in our power to reduce them."
As it so happens, Bouquet's troops were suffering a smallpox epidemic, and Bouquet proposed taking the blankets from the sick men and distribute it to the Indians. In his words, "I will try to inoculate the Indians with some blankets that may fall in their hands, and take care not to get the disease myself." Amherst approved and replied,
"You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as trying every other method you can serve to extirpate this execrable race."
Though the blankets were distributed, they were redundant, as smallpox was already spread to the Indians, having jumped from Europeans to Indians in the area. Indeed, the disease was the downfall of Pontiac's forces. One observer under Bouquet wrote, "The smallpox has been very general and raging among the Indians since last spring. The poor rascals are dying very fast with the smallpox. They can make but little resistance, and when routed from their settlements, must perish in great numbers by the disorders." Thanks to the epidemic, the British forces deployed and managed to roll back the Indians, with Bouquet crushing a Pontiac allied army at the Battle of Bushy Run near Fort Pitt. Bouquet then dispatched troops to burn nearby Indian villages to drive them out of the territory. Indeed, while the Indians were masters at raiding garrisons and terrorizing European settlers, their main weakness was that they lacked the men to defend their own women and children in their own villages in the event of retaliation. Many of the ousted Indian civilians would die from hunger and disease while on the run. With the policy of annihilating Indian villages, many of the different tribes that were allied with Pontiac broke off from the alliance and signed separate peaces with Britain. To keep the frontier secure and facilitate peace, the British government finally recalled Amherst from his office in America and provided many provisions to help peace, trying to repair British-Indian relations and even solidifying the Proclamation Line of 1763, telling the American settlers that they were not allowed to move west and settle in Indian territory. The Americans were outraged, as Americans had been champing at the bit for the opportunity to move west. In fact, many Americans gave their lives in the 7 Years' War with the intent of dislodging the French just so that the Americans could move west. Though the Proclamation Line of 1763 was a prelude to the anger between the Americans and the British Imperial Authority, it did improve relations somewhat with the Indians, and so peace was declared and Pontiac's war came to an end. For the British and Americans, the war was largely considered a success, as the British Empire in America did not lose territory. Meanwhile, the Indians also deemed the war a success, in the sense that they received many benefits from the peace deal. However, the failure of Pontiac to kick the British out of the interior reflected poorly upon him. His Ottawa tribe turned their backs on him, and the younger Ottawa warriors looked at Pontiac as if he was an old relic of the past. Pontiac would be stabbed to death by a Peoria Indian at a trading post on the Mississippi River in 1769, and the Ottawas didn't even lift a finger to avenge their slain chief. For the American settlers, the horrors seen in Pontiac's war led to a deep fear of the Indians, and only underlined their savagery to the Americans. Refugees and displaced settlers continued to walk the lands of America for a while after the war having left its mark on American society. One inhabitant of Frederick, Maryland, says, "Every day for some time past has offered a melancholy scene of poor distressed families driving downwards through this town with their effects, who have deserted their plantations for fear of falling into the cruel hands of our savage enemies, now daily seen in the woods." One man in Winchester, Virginia, states,
"Near 500 families have run away within this week. I assure you, it was most melancholy sight to see such numbers of poor people, who have abandoned their settlements in such consternation and hurry that they had hardly anything within them but their children. And what is still worse, I dare say, there is not money enough amongst the whole families to maintain a fifth part of them till the fall, and none of the poor creatures can get a hovel to shelter them from the weather, but lie about scattering in the woods."
the Americans began to see the Indians as not just a threat to the frontier, but an existential danger to settlement on the continent as a whole, and the nightmarish scenes of Pontiac's War would haunt the Americans for generations to come. Nearly half a century later, during Tecumseh's War, the Americans would reference the events of the bloody Pontiac War that kept them up at night from hearing stories from their grandfathers. And that's going to wrap up this episode of Primus Academy. I hope you've enjoyed. Consider subscribing to the channel for more nerdy content. Consider checking out my social media. Links to all can be found in the description below. And consider supporting me on Patreon if you want to see this channel continue. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day, ladies and gentlemen. Huge thanks to our patrons, including this month's $10 plus patron, Josh Adkins. Check out the description for more patrons and more info about how you can receive a shout out here.